Hello Upgraders and welcome to another episode of the Upgraded Ape Show. I'm your host Will Barron, and on today's show we have Katy Bowman. Katy is a director of the Restorative Health Institute. She's a biomechanist by training and has helped thousands to reduce chronic pain, increase bone density and improve metabolic health through movement and proper alignment. On today's show we dive into the specific question which had been bandied around the media recently of, is sitting the new smoking? Katy actually blew my mind of how simple the solution and explanations for this actually are. And it's a great show for anyone who spends any amount of time sitting throughout the day, whether that be in the car or at a desk in an office, because the solution's really simple. As I mentioned, the explanation of why it's bad for you is equally as simple, and Katy was a great guest. Today's show is sponsored by the pre-launch of my new and first book, Upgrade Your Brain, which is an uncommon guide to the mental energy, high IQ and ultra memory of the elite. It features lots of the guests from the Upgraded Ape Show, case studies, numbers and real data to help you upgrade your brain. But the whole point of the book is that it's easy to read, it's easy to dip in and out of, and I include lots of anecdotes and stories of real people who are upgrading or have upgraded their brains, so it can act as a real guide for you, the reader. The book is really just a massive experiment, just like Upgraded Ape and the different shows that we're producing. In that, obviously, it was written by myself, but I've also done the covers, the editing, the formatting of the book itself. I've not physically printed it at home on my printer, but I've arranged for all the printing and artwork to be done. And we're selling it exclusively through the upgradedape.com web store. So it's fully self-published from start to finish. And yeah, it's an experiment. We'll see how it goes. And there's another couple of books in the pipeline that have been drafted so far. So yeah, if you go to upgradedape.com, you'll see links to the book there where you can purchase it or get a free chapter to check it out. And so, without further ado, let's get on with today's show.
Welcome to the Upgraded Ape Show, your daily dose of brain upgrades to help you kick life's ass. And here's your host, Will Barron.
Hi Katy, and welcome to the Upgraded Ape Show.
Hey Will, thanks for having me.
No worries whatsoever. Let's jump straight into the questions. And can you tell us a little bit about your story and what got you interested in researching and writing about movement science?
Well, my background is I've always been interested in how things work in general. And when I went to university, I was attracted to the maths and the physics. But after doing that for a few years, it wasn't applicable enough. I didn't feel like it had any context for anything because I also like to work on big problems. You know, I like to be a bit philosophical about some of the broader questions that everyone is kind of pondering all of the time. So I found a small program called biomechanics, and I realized that it was essentially everything that I had already studied, the math and the physics and the mechanics applied to an actual moving structure instead of point masses and lines and things that weren't really real or didn't really exist. And then biomechanics in the university where I was at was in the kinesiology department. So it was really looking at the physics of how people move. And so when I was done, I actually went out in the field and worked with helping people, usually athletes, and that train better, or if a general population had an injury or a surgery, they would come to see me because I had a little bit a more deeper understanding, I would say, of mechanics because of my degree. And then after seeing a lot of people with a lot of the exact same issues, and then having a lot of the exact same set of mechanical properties that I could detect, the way that they moved specifically and the loads that they were creating by how they moved, I decided to go back to graduate school to see if I could study biomechanics on a cellular level, because I've always been really interested in cultural incidence of disease. And so that was kind of my story. That's how I ended up where I am now, working with the public and educating the public on how your cells work and then how that affects the sum total of your physical experience.
That's awesome. It's absolutely fascinating. I've got a similar journey in history as well of I really liked the physics and the math side of things, but then I didn't really find them applicable. So I went down the chemistry route of looking at cells on a big scale, but obviously everything else on the organic smaller scale. And I found that absolutely fascinating as well. So let's start, I guess, at the smallest level and the cellular level. And would mechanotransduction be a good place to start here?
Yeah, mechanotransduction, I think, is this underlying process that I would like to have people, even if they didn't understand the nuances, to be aware that it's happening. Because I think for many people out there who are listening right now who have some sort of issue, some sort of niggling issue, by understanding mechanotransduction, I think a whole world of solutions open up for you that you might not have had before. So let's start there.
Okay, awesome. Do you want to just give us a quick overview of what it is?
No, yes, I do. Mechanotransduction, in a nutshell, is the process of a cell converting mechanical input, specifically the way that that cell has been deformed, whether it's being pushed or pulled or twisted or sheared, taking that mechanical input and turning that input in to a chemical signal that then affects how the cell behaves.
When the cell goes through that process, why does it have to create a chemical signal? What is that chemical signal then doing or triggering further along the chain?
Well, I mean, if you're a biochemist, then so much of the regulatory behavior of cells are chemical. So if you're studying cellular behavior, if you're an anatomy or a physiology student, or you're an oncologist or a cancer researcher, what you've been doing historically is looking at what are the cells, what are the neurotransmitters, like what is the chemical process of these diseases, and we've been able to figure out so many of the what's the chemical environment that leads to a certain genetic expression, that leads to a certain disease profile, or what is the chemical environment that are risk factors for certain diseases. But that was really the way it's been looked at historically. Very recently, is there this understanding that before the chemical process was some sort of mechanical signal, before the chemistry that everyone has been able to figure out was some sort of mechanical stimulation or some sort of mechanical signaling that was happening before, that was in fact the catalyst for the chemistry. And so that changes everything, really, because we've essentially been studying cells in a vacuum without really looking at them in their physical environment. I mean, everyone's in a physical environment, and the way that you move or don't, and the way that you're positioned when you're moving or not moving, all of those things are creating a cellular experience that then are resulting in these this chemistry that then ends up affecting the behavior of the cells. And so one of the things I talk about in Move Your DNA is that genetic expression itself has never really been understood as something that is brought about by a mechanical signal. The fact that the cytoskeleton, which is a structure within the cell, very similar to our bones within the body, it's this physical structure that, as it's deformed, can communicate directly with the nucleus. Now, that's pretty radical, because we weren't aware of other structures being able to give input into the nucleus that then affects genetic expression. So that's this field of mechanotransduction that's new. I mean, is it new? I don't know. Wolff's Law has been around for over 100 years. So people have understood that there are structural adaptations to how you move. It's just that maybe there wasn't an understanding, because we didn't have nanotechnology, that it's really happening all the way down on the cellular level.
So if we look at that then and scale it up slightly, it could be a case of performing a movement or an exercise poorly causes the cell structure to change, which then can trigger something like inflammation, or the cell's been damaged. Is that about right?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's been damaged per se. I would just say that it's a type of an input. Your cells, your structure needs to be able to bear the loads of your life. And so in some cases, the repetitive process of loading can result in damage, which then oftentimes can result in inflammation, as well as an increased production of mass, right? So your bones get become more dense, or your muscles can become greater in terms of mass. So there's a response. There's a behavioral response that just depends on what the input is. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily inflammation. I would say that the adaptation is based on whatever it needs to be depending on the load.
Okay, and to look at this from a different angle then, what kind of issues can we have from the cell not being put under a load? Leading on to the bigger picture of issues with people sitting for long periods during the day.
Well, and so what I try to explain in the book is there is really no not being under load. If you're sitting there right now, all of your cells are under a load. It might not be the load that you would be under if you were standing or walking, but you are under your cells are all experiencing loads 100% of the time. So with disease, specifically, like we talk about, headlines like is sitting the new smoking, and sitting kills, and all. People are trying to understand, like, what is it about being sedentary that's the problem? And so I would say in general, people go, oh, because you need to move more. And yes, that's absolutely the case. However, just moving more isn't really the solution that we're after, that there are these loads that your body depend on that are wildly varying. There's many different loads that your body needs to experience in order to have the adaptations that best support long-term biological function. So if you're sitting around a lot, you're probably sitting in the exact same way over and over again. So the load in that case is repetitive. It's a very repetitive load. And then there are these broader tissue adaptations where if you don't move a lot of your individual parts, they begin to kind of start clumping together. So then when you go out and move, you are moving less of your cells. The cells themselves aren't able to experience the full load of the movement. So like if you sit all day, but then you go out and exercise for an hour or two, and then you sit after you're done with that all of you really isn't participating in that bout of movement, that there's been these cellular and tissue adaptations that have made not moving so much easier on you. And that's really where the diseases start to come into play.
And is this happening for most people most of the time? And that's what results in, as you're young, you kind of can throw yourself around, you don't get hurt as much. And as you get older, perhaps you get a bit stiffer, things like arthritis start to come in, which then further limit the potential exercising that you can do. Is it a downward spiral from the point where you are not moving around every day, which usually is when people either get into school or start a job or an office job?
Yeah, you definitely start to lose. You start to lose a lot of mobility because of our high input of doing a repetitive stillness. So kids, little babies are, very mobile, and then they become more stable through muscular use, depending on, if they're getting it or not. But then once they go into school, we all went into school probably around 5, and then sitting was a kind of expected large portion of the day. And then you slowly get this cellular clumping where you've got many, many joints in the body, but you begin to use less of them. And then when you use less of them, kind of like the use it or lose it thing, if you use less of them, then they don't become available to you really to move anymore. So then you start to get excessive movements in the joints that you do use, and lack of movement in the joints that you don't. And then you're starting to get within your body these patterns of adaptation that are very strong in some areas or locations, and then very weak in others. And so the thing with exercise is when you become really, really strong in one way, all the other parts of you that didn't exercise or didn't participate in the bout of whatever you're doing for exercise got relatively weaker. So then there's this natural stress riser, which is a mechanical term, which is when you've got one material of one strength sitting next to a material of a different strength. So even though you're all cells and you're all tissue, when you have a tissue that is stronger sitting next to a tissue that is not as strong, that's going to be the interface between those two is where your injuries are going to start popping up.
And to put that on kind of a practical level, I do a lot of rock climbing, and pretty much every injury I've ever had from that has been from having lots of pull strength, but not a lot of push strength.
Right.
So to put it into perspective for listeners, is this something that can, one, be reversed, and two, is there a perfect exercise? And I imagine the answer is no, but is there a perfect exercise to hit all these points, become mega mobile, and reduce any risks that are associated with all this?
Well, is it reversible? Sure. You're constantly adapting to whatever you do, so you just need to do differently. That all being said, just doing differently is not the only thing that you need to do. You also need to address the tissues that you currently are. So we always say you are how you eat. You are actually how you move. So there's been this way that you have moved through, however many decades of your life, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. So you've moved a particular way and you have tissue adaptations. Your mass has structurally laid out based on what you have done. So when you decide to do something new, I think everyone who exercises understands this. Like when you decide to do something that's drastically different than what you have done, that there's this period of time in which you approach what you're going to do now in small percentages of change. So like if you're a couch potato and you've been a couch potato for 30 years, if you decide to run a marathon, you're going to have this program that's broken down into short runs that are feasible, and maybe even within the run are just periods of time in which you're alternating between running and walking, and so there's this progression that is the most smart. But the reason you're doing that progression is because you need this cellular adaptation to be happening so that when you eventually get to the thing that you're going to do, whether it's a marathon or a triathlon or whatever, or climbing some big structure, that you have brought your tissue along with you slowly, so that you have the masses and that you have all of the what I call the equipment that you need for the event. So I talk about things like individual degrees of range of motion and the capillaries to different areas in the body. Those are all pieces of equipment that you grow as you train. And so when you think about your body as this really dynamic structure where you're constantly growing or cannibalizing structures depending on how you move, then you understand a little bit more that it takes a long time usually to transition behaviors. And a lot of people will jump to doing something like an all-day standing workstation, or they jumped into minimal shoes, or they'll jump into a heavy lifting routine, and then the injury is arising because they didn't literally have the structure necessary to do those other things. But yeah, so there's not really an exercise. We're talking about natural loads, and that all the natural loads that the body would have experienced were still out in nature for the bulk of its life, and the structure that it would have. So in the book, I'm putting together kind of this program, I guess, if you will, for how to restore some sort of natural movement, but it's not really an exercise like people are thinking about it right now. It's decidedly not anything that you can do for an hour a day. It really is changing how you load your structure throughout the entire day.
Well, you mentioned something then in standing desks, and that's something that I'm keen to get your opinion on. As I've mentioned, I spend a lot of time through doing these interviews and editing and speaking to customers over email. I spend a lot of time sat at my desk. I've got a reasonably comfortable chair that adjusts, and I've done the research of looking into that and my posture. But are we even designed to be sat down? Should we all be stood up at our desks if you have to be there?
Well, I mean, in the same way that you're not, we'll say designed to sit down, you're not designed to stand in place for 8 hours a day either. That's one of my big arguments is we can't be too narrow-sighted on this. I mean, you're not meant to be still. Still for 8 hours a day is the unnatural part. There's not really any unnatural position if the body can get into it. By definition, it's a natural position. It's the repetitiveness of the position. So one of the reasons sitting 8 hours a day is so hard on the body is it introduces it introduces a repetitiveness to a particular geometry. So if you look at your body sitting in a chair and you kind of plot the main axes of your body like a constellation. So you put a star at your shoulders and your hip joint and your knee and your foot. Like there's a constellation that your body assumes when you're sitting in a chair. And there's nothing wrong with that constellation per se, But because you've been assuming that geometrical position for decades, you have actually began to change the mass distribution of your cells. It affects the genetic expression of your cells. Specifically, of maybe greatest interest would be within the arterial walls of your body. So if we're talking about plaque, you've introduced all of these bends and curves into your joints and aren't supposed to be there at the frequency in which they are. And then you start to see plaque accumulation in these areas because of this repetitive trauma that happens between the interaction of the blood flowing and the wall that's not supposed to be directly in front of it, right? It's supposed to be more like flowing down a tube, and now it's flowing more around a crazy straw, lots of different curves. And so you're increasing the interaction, which wouldn't be a big deal if you were in that sitting position, 15 minutes here, 10 minutes there, and then you were in lots of other positions throughout the day. It's just that you've been crashing the blood into your walls repetitively for decades, and there's a problem with it. So standing in one way is great because it changes the loads. So it's different. I'm a fan of standing workstations. I'm a fan of actually what I call dynamic workstations. So dynamic workstations would be the understanding that you can be in one location, like your office, and get done lots of work, but that doesn't mean that you have to be in the same position over that period of time to get it done. That we've got to start thinking a little bit more broadly and recognizing that there's a lot of movement available to us, even when we're relatively still, like relative to the ground. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question there, but I think I did.
Yeah, you did in one way. And it was absolutely fascinating that a physical change in the body can cause, with your arteries that you mentioned, it seems so obvious, but then it's something that most people wouldn't think of.
I don't know why. I think it's interesting because I talk a lot about things that people go, that makes so much sense. It's so obvious, but they're not, when you're a mechanics minded person, obviously my bias, my filter is always going to be biomechanics, but people are concerned about arterial plaque. I mean, that's a real issue. It's still, the number one killer of people, in the United States, and heart disease is something that people should be thinking about. But people are really interested in their diet, which is amazing. However, the big red flag is that your deposits of plaque it's not a system. Like if you have arterial plaque, you don't have arterial plaque everywhere in your body. You have it there's very specific sites in the body that are prone to arterial plaque accumulation, and they differ from person to person. So you could have a blood cholesterol of, X, and you could have a diet of X, and your diet and your cholesterol is systemic experience, but your plaque might be just in the left femoral artery, just in the left hip. And it's also maybe the place where you experience a hernia. And like when you start to look at things where there's clearly something else going on that's site specific, that's not a systemic phenomenon, your first point of investigation should be, following biological plausibility and Occam's razor type thing, which is, okay, what's making the plaque dump right here when the blood cholesterol is the same throughout the blood, and when, your exercise habits are across the board for the whole body. So I just kind of try to point that out. And it's all in the cardiovascular literature. I mean, as far as hemodynamics go, it's not anything that those who study the biomechanics of blood flow and arterial plaque don't know. It's just those people are not the people who treat heart disease and arterial plaque and diet. So it's just the reduction of science into different portals of interest and the failure to kind of reintegrate and get everyone back into the room to solve, the problem that everyone's most concerned with is probably the issue.
And I guess it's, from a side note, it's difficult to get, I'm sure it'd be more difficult to get funding for a researcher to do something like that than it would be something that's backed by a drug company who's trying to get a drug to sell to solve a similar issue, if not the same issue.
Right. There's nothing to sell, so to speak. There's certainly nothing to mass produce with a huge profit margin to spot treat a mechanical issue, right? That's just on the person who's moving. So it's like, you're going to have to learn how to move a whole different way. And like, that's not really attractive to most people, certainly not most, medical business people.
Uh-huh. Well, thinking about that, I'm going to have a look at my office. So where I'm sat now, I could definitely have some kind of standing desk. And it seems like I need some kind of beanbag to be laid down, and then some kind of standing yoga treadmill as well. Something where I can move whilst being at a laptop.
Yeah, I mean,
I think there's a product or an invention or something there.
Yeah, if you have a floor, like there's one option, just sitting on the floor, putting your bottom up on a couple pillows or a box. If you're not used to sitting on the floor, most people don't have the range of motion for it. Sitting cross-legged, sitting with your legs out in a V, those are all different load nutrients. Those are all different joint actions and loads that you would be experiencing where moving your body out. Standing is one, and also sitting at your desk is fine, but then sitting in your desk in different ways. Those are also different loads to introduce while you are in your office. And then I recommend that everyone gets kind of like a chin-up bar for their office door. Just even if you're just hanging, just enough to take some of the kinks out of the neck and the shoulders and get a nice trunk load, and then intermittent walking breaks for sure.
That's awesome advice. Absolutely awesome. Katy, can we go on and do some quickfire questions to learn a little bit more about yourself?
Yes.
What is one book other than your own that you'd recommend to the Upgraded Ape audience?
The book that I recommend to anyone who deals with anyone else would be the use and misuse of language. It's a book on general semantics, and it's from 1970, and I don't even know if it's in print anymore, but if you can scoop up one on, Amazon's used book list, you can usually get it for a couple bucks, and it is, it's an absolute human communication necessity.
Awesome. That is totally out of the blue and not what I was expecting.
Sorry.
No, that's good. That's good. That's exactly what we want. Okay, next question, which is again totally out of the blue and probably not what you're expecting, but what was your first pet called?
My first pet? My very own first pet was a dog named Haley. I named her after Haley's Comet.
Nice. That's a cool name. Next question. If you could punch someone in the face, who would it be? If
I could punch someone in the face?
If you could punch anybody in the face.
I think I would love to be able to punch myself in the face, because then I would know that I had achieved some sort of really nice relationship with myself. So I'll put myself down.
Is this like Fight Club style?
It's more like, there's got to be some sort of biological mechanism that keeps you from punching yourself in the face. So if I could overcome that, I would feel like I had mastered myself just a little bit. So maybe, yeah, Fight Club.
Fair enough. That's probably not an experiment I'm going to try, Katy, but what is one thing that you're grateful for today?
Ooh, I am grateful for the 5-mile walk I took this morning.
And final quickfire question. If you could spend 2 minutes with anyone, dead or alive, who would it be?
2 minutes. You know what? Since it's only 2 minutes, I think it would be, I'd love to spend 2 minutes with the most authentic version of myself, the person I haven't met yet.
Wow, great answer. And is that someone that you envision is going to be in the future, or is that someone that I don't know?
I don't know. And I said,
is that an ideal, or is that something that will ever be achieved, do you think?
Well, I'm working on it. And I mean, the level that I'll get to it will be, I'll meet that person, but I mean, most authentic. And I said her, and I imagine that the most authentic version of myself isn't even a her. So I'm clearly not there yet.
Well, Katy, I've got one final question for you, and this is something I've asked everyone who's come on the show so far. And kind of similar to what we just talked about, but if you could go back in time and speak to a younger Katy, what would be one piece of advice you'd give her to help her upgrade her brain?
I think that I would probably tell a younger version of myself to be much less concerned with everyone else's feelings or expectations of me than I might be letting down by pursuing my flow, my authentic passion, my dreams. And I would just say that you've wasted so much stress and it's been deflected. You've deflected your your inner laser beam by worrying about that, and to let that go, because they're not really going to be bothered by it. And if they are, they're going to learn not to be.
Awesome answer, Katy. Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up the show. And I'd love you if you could tell us a little bit more about where we can find more about you and more about your books.
Well, you can find more about me on my blog, katysays.com, Katy says.com. And the institute is Restorative Exercise Institute, so it's restorativeexercise.com. And between those two places, you can find out anything that you've ever wanted about me, mechanotransduction, standing workstations, and Move Your DNA.
Awesome stuff. Well, Katy, I just want to say thanks again for your time today. Really appreciate it. And thanks for coming on the Upgraded Ape Show.
All right. Thanks, Will.